Hello everybody and welcome back to the Sanctuary. I'm your host, Professor C. We're going to do some more A&P today. Specifically, I'm going to take us through the details of the maxillary bones, and also known as the maxillae. So, let's do it. The maxilla is the upper tooth-bearing bone, or the immovable jawbone in the human body. It is purple, and I'll put an X on it here. In the skull picture, it forms the front part of the face and is sometimes referred to as the facial keystone bone. If you can remember from our talk about the sphenoid bone, which is this, I'll put a check on it, this pink bone right here, the butterfly or the bat bone, it was called the cranial keystone because it articulated with all the other cranial bones. Maxilla is called the facial keystone because it articulates with all the other facial bones. So let's take a look at the details. Again, at the same time, we can look at the unarticulated maxilla up here, which does look a little strange. It did to me, at least, when I saw it for the first time. So it does fuse medially, meaning it used to start as two separate bones, and it will form the hard palate, which we'll see in another picture. We can't see it from this aspect, and the main portion of the face. Again, it does form the infraorbital margin, especially the medial aspect right over here. And just to recap, if you haven't seen the other ones, the rest of the infraorbital margin is completed by the zygomatic bone, and then the supraorbital margin is all frontal bone. Okay, the infraorbital foramen. So, if I can clear my ink, if you look here at the frontal bone, we had this supraorbital foramen, this hole above the orbit. So here in the maxilla, we'll have an infraorbital foramen, a hole underneath the orbits. And in some pictures, like look up here, and this unarticulated bone, it kind of just looks like a crack sometimes, and it's obscured by some of the curvature. So in the right light, this disappears. So you have to see this one almost fully front on to see a really shot of the infraorbital foramina. Okay, a zygomatic process again is going to be reaching for the zygomatic bone. We saw this when we talked about the zygomatic bone, if you want to go watch that lecture. And there at the arrow and here with the arrow, those would be the two zygomatic processes. If I looked at the bone up top, I could put ZP here and ZP over here, and that's a pretty good spot to say there are the two zygomatic processes. The frontal process, again, there would be one on each side, should head up to the frontal bone. So on the picture downtown, I can draw an arrow that points up this way, the purple, and the arrow that points up this way in the purple, and you see those long pointy things heading up to the frontal bone. On the picture up top, I can see one here. I can put a lasso, and I'll lasso it there, and I'll say those are the two frontal processes right there. Of course, being that this is another tooth-bearing bone, we should see the alveolar processes, ba-bump, 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 where the teeth are, and down here on the bottom I see ba-bump, 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 what we'd call the tooth sockets, or the alveolar processes that allow the tooth to stick into the maxilla. Okay, if you flip the skull from the underside, things look a little bit different. First of all, let me just hone you in on where we were. There is the zygomatic process of the maxilla, and here, the little hole, there is that infraorbital foramen, and it's hard to see it there. The one on the other side is even harder to see, but there it is, the infraorbital foramen on the other side. One of the first things I want to point out here, and I'll highlight it in yellow, is all of this structure back here is called the hard palate. And it's called hard palate because it's made out of two different bones. Similarly to the way we had the nasal septum that was made of some of the ethmoid bone and some of it was the vomer bone, which we can see right here, little blue vomer. The palate, the hard palate, is made of two different bones as well. The majority of it is made by the maxilla. So let's go through some structures here. Right here in front, most anterior portion of the underside of the maxilla, behind the two incisors there is a crack, and we're going to call that the incisive fossa. Yes, some places call that a full-bone foramen and other terms as well. Here I'll call it the incisive fossa. So the palatine processes, which I'm going to put PP and PP, there they are. There's the palatine processes. They form the anterior, the front 2/3 of the hard palate. And of course, the back portion is going to be formed by that gray bone here, which we'll call the palatine bone, which we'll see in a moment. Transverse palatine suture is right here that separates those two processes of the maxilla from the palatine bone that is posterior to it. Okay, so without further ado, here comes the palatine bone. Again, it's this little gray guy. Or in this picture down here, a nice picture of the blue. The blue would be the palatine bone there. So right here on the top, I'm just going to kind of hash it out. That's called the horizontal plate, and it forms the posterior, the back 1/3 of the hard palate. The greater and lesser palatine foramina. Now again, depending on the picture you're looking at, you can see these either really well or not so good at all. Here in this one I can see what looks like a smaller one and a bigger one. I'll kind of highlight them here, a smaller one and a bigger one. Oftentimes they're just shown as one hole, like right here on the top skull. I'm circling these two little foramina. Those are probably the graters. You'd have to turn it to see. Alright, if you enjoyed the talk on the maxilla and the palatine, thanks for watching it, and check out some other videos in the series. See you next time. Bye-bye.